Thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? So I'm going to say a few words. I wrote something especially for you, for Blair. And I'm going to read a little bit from my latest book, Our Lost Border. And I was one of the editors of this collection, and it came out this year in April 2013. And then I would love to answer your questions. I love Q&A. I love to mix it up with the crowd. I do this almost every week with my students at Yale. And if you didn't get a free bookmark, there are a lot right here in front. Just pass them out. So I want to thank Blair Academy, in particular Dr. Martin Miller, for inviting me today. Great teachers have made all the difference in the world in my life. And Dr. Miller is one of those teachers who should be justly revered. I first came to Blair Academy during the summer of 1978 as part of a 6-week program that trained high school journalists, the Blair Summer School for Journalism. I was an ambitious but somewhat intimidated 17-year-old boy from the U.S.-Mexico border who had grown up with an outhouse in the backyard and kerosene lamps and stoves instead of electricity. That summer at Blair, as I was guided by our mutual friend Ron Clements, who ran BSSJ, I took my love of writing to another level. I learned to live on my own and compete with students I believe were much better than me. I survived, and that summer I even got kissed by a hot blonde from New Jersey. Remember, I was 17. Now as the father of 2 boys, 16 and 18, yes, I know exactly what is on their minds. Anyway, I never forgot that gray stone arch at Blair Academy, the beauty of the school, the intensity of that summer program, and how all of it seemed to be on another planet from Isleta, the hamlet outside of El Paso, Texas, where I lived in an adobe house with my family. The following year, I would be accepted to Harvard, an even greater cultural and academic leap from the border. But without Blair, without that summer of 78, without that newfound belief in myself, I would have most likely crumpled under the pressure at Harvard Yard. So first and foremost, I want to thank Blair Academy for once having that wonderful summer program for high school journalists. And to let you know, it was essential for me as a person, as a fledgling writer, and as a teacher I would become. First, I want to talk to you about what the effect was of bringing a kid from the border to a place like Blair or Harvard. And then also talk to you about how I want to bring attention to the U.S.-Mexico border in another way, and how that's relevant to you at Blair. The point is always to demystify this faraway place and its people, to find a relation to the border, even if that place or someone from that place seems foreign and other, so to speak. That is the type of practical education that I have always pursued in my life. Not to assume what is right, but to test it out. Not to accept the norm, but to determine what the norm is and why it's a norm through engagement. That's also why I became a follower of Aristotle, philosophically, because I lived on the border between English and Spanish, between the United States and Mexico, neither completely here nor there. I was forced to find my own way, rather than simply to accept a prescribed way. I am the ultimate skeptic in this society of skeptics. I am a skeptic of ideologues, nationalists from both countries, and those purists too eager to find a home in assumptions and prejudices about people who look different from them, who might have funny accents. If you think about it, being a skeptic is really not It's really about not being so easily at home in a way. It's about living on philosophical and moral borders, so to speak. You need a strong character to survive this constant skepticism. And you need to find your home in practical reason. But try staying warm and dry under a rainstorm in this so-called home, and you will see how lonely and cold the life of a true skeptic can often be. But all of you should take heart. You will have great company around our skeptical bonfire on the levee. When you bring a kid from the US-Mexico border to a place like Blair, Harvard, or Yale, how do you do it? What can we learn from this experience? These questions become important as Latinos are becoming a bigger demographic part of the United States and are enrolling in higher education in record numbers. The answers to these questions are also relevant to educating any student to be the first in his or her family to achieve a college education or to attend a wonderful prep school in preparation for college. In my mind, it is heartening that Blair Academy, your school, gives 38% of current students some financial aid. My son's prep school in New York, you might know it, Collegiate, has a similar percentage of students on financial aid. John Bogle, the founder of the Vanguard Group, and one of my investment heroes, was a scholarship boy at Blair and has become one of its most important benefactors. So crossing this social mobility border, so to speak, can bring benefits not only to those poor students, but also to the institution that grants him or her that opportunity. What I believe Harvard saw in me when they accepted me as a senior from Isleta High School, that year after my summer at Blair, was a poor but intelligent kid who was willing to work beyond exhaustion, who was willing to sacrifice dearly for his goal, and who had the capacity to adapt to a new environment. These immigrant values came from my Mexican parents, and these are the same values I teach to Aaron and Isaac on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where I live now. My older son Aaron, by the way, is a freshman at Yale. So when a place like Blair or Harvard is trying to identify that poor kid who might succeed in these rarefied environments, you have to start by understanding that student's family, its discipline, its character, the values they practice. These family values, an old-fashioned term, but still important today, help my family in Isleta stay away from the drugs in our neighborhood, the gangs on the streets, the easy excuses of not doing your work, of not being responsible, of not taking responsibility. Of course, not all the families in Isleta, which is less than a mile from Mexico, shared or practiced these values. We were all poor. We had all started the same way on a dusty lot with nothing but a few rooms of adobe. Many of my grade school friends ended up dead from gang fights or other bad choices. But certain families created a separate culture within their homes, a culture enforced by a strong mother or father or both. And those families crossed the border from Isleta to higher planes of success. To identify these poor families who have the groundwork, values necessary for success, well, that requires painstaking work, that requires understanding the nuances of a neighborhood. That requires not prejudging places like Isleta as lost causes simply by the shacks in the neighborhood, the Spanish spoken on the streets, or the dark brown faces of its children. Ironically, in New York's Upper West Side, I have learned our family has had to keep another culture at arm's length, another culture not worth emulating. That culture of what I call too much materialism. That culture of doting parents who instead of being tough on their children, excuse every failure and extol even mediocre accomplishments. That culture of well-to-do parents who do not read to their young toddlers, who think giving money is good parenting. It's not. Even though I live at a much higher economic level than my parents ever did in Isleta, I know that their values adapted to my children in New York City have helped my kids succeed academically and become responsible citizens. My sons call me the toughest dad on the Upper West Side. Every summer, instead of hanging out with their friends and wasting time, my sons immerse themselves in intensive foreign language programs, or jumped ahead of their classes at collegiate by taking extra math courses, or enrolled in grueling outdoor leadership courses to test their limits and hone skills not found in the classroom. Saturdays and Sundays, we work academically, on extra reading, on a project of their choosing. When family friends found out my son Aaron scored a 2400 on his SAT, yeah, that's right. So you guys are looking at each other, a perfect score. They kidded me about being like a tiger mom. And I said, no, I'm not a tiger mom. I'm a jaguar dad. A Mexican jaguar dad. So you see, Isleta has as much to teach the Upper West Side and places like Blair or Harvard or Yale as those places had to teach Isleta. Too often we think from high atop our revered institutions that we are giving an opportunity to these poor kids, that we are just the ones doing the generous giving, so to speak. We forget that these kids, these poor kids from the border and beyond, those with the right values, are reintroducing our revered institution to what made them revered in the first place: hard work, sacrifice, real achievement, and risk mixed with adaptation. So when everything works out, a great school will be doing that scholarship boy or girl a favor by accepting them and giving them an opportunity. But in turn, he or she will be doing that school a favor by the character and fresh perspective they bring to that school. I want to switch now and talk to you about how the US-Mexico border is relevant to Blair Academy today, and particularly to you as students. Afterwards, I want to read briefly from this new book, Our Lost Border, which I co-edited. And then I want to answer any of your questions about being a child of the border itself, being a writer and an editor in New York, or teaching at Yale. Are any of you waiting for that last episode of Breaking Bad on Sunday, right? For what happens to that character, Walter White? I am. I'm a fan of the television series, in part because it is so well done as storytelling, but also because it focuses on Albuquerque and El Paso, and on a dramatized version of the drug wars that have been happening in my old stomping grounds for decades. While some of you may never visit the border, or these cities near the border, Breaking Bad and shows like it may be the only real exposure you have to it, to the border. It's a safe exposure through a television screen. And you may think that what happens on the US-Mexico border in terms of the drug wars is not really relevant to you at Blair Academy, except as entertainment. I see something similar in another favorite comedian I watch, Jon Stewart of The Daily Show. He often laughs about drug use and about how oh so cool it is to smoke marijuana and do drugs. I laugh at him too. He's funny. And I also know that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not supposed to. He's a comedian. But I wonder how many people watching him take his bong jokes at face value and not think for a moment about what he is saying and what it might mean. I'll say it to you as bluntly as I told my teenage sons. If you smoke pot, if you do drugs, you're killing Mexicans. You are destroying poor families along the border. You are part of the problem. In fact, this is what I told my sons exactly. Whenever you light up a joint, you are decapitating a Mexican. That equation is dramatic for effect, but roughly true. Marijuana is the #1 cash crop of narco-traffickers along the border. Since Aaron and Isaac have been to Isleta, since they love their abuelitos and know my neighborhood from years of Christmas gatherings and family vacations, since the Mexicans in question are not abstractions, but decent people with real lives, who send them gifts for their birthday, who hug and kiss them every time we go back to Isleta. The force of what I told my sons hit hard. Hit them where they live. I want this equation to hit you as hard as it hit Aaron and Isaac, because this is so important for you now and for your future. A few weeks before Aaron went to Yale for freshman orientation in August, we received a pamphlet from Yale about how to talk to your son or daughter about alcohol and drug abuse, a severe problem at almost every university in this country, at many public high schools, at many prep schools. Yale now requires all incoming freshmen to take a mandatory online course on alcohol and drug abuse before enrolling freshman year. Did you know that? A week after we received Yale's pamphlet, a week after I had my talk with Aaron and Isaac, what happened? A drug addict broke into my parents' home in Isleta, and with a crowbar ripped open the back door when my 78-year-old parents were out shopping. Neighbors called the cops, and the idiot stumbled out of my parents' house, got into his truck, and crashed into an electric pole down the block. The police arrested him, and my parents arrived to see their neighbors in their yard. They were lucky. This is the first time someone had broken into their home in 40 years. But the point is, we are all connected. What we do at Blair, what we do at Yale, what we do at Harvard, what we do in New York City, if we are doing drugs, if we are smoking what we think is a harmless joint, then that action has ramifications on the border. That action affects poor families in places like Isleta. That action takes the pleasures of the well-to-do and the conveniently ignorant and dumps the consequences on the poor, the dark-skinned, the third world in Texas and New Mexico, and many places in between. I proposed the idea for this book, Our Lost Border, because I wanted Americans to see their role in the drug wars that took such a much more violent turn after 2008. I wanted them to see the families destroyed, the communities abandoned. The narco-traffickers are fighting for the billions and billions of dollars we provide to them when we buy their drugs. That's the money they use to corrupt American FBI agents in El Paso. That's the money they use to buy government and law enforcement officials in northern Mexico. That's the money they use to buy their guns, to kill other drug dealers, and to kill innocents. And so turn Juarez, the city in Mexico opposite of El Paso, into a more dangerous place than Lebanon, Damascus, even Cairo. We are all connected. The point of the book, Our Lost Border, is to demystify this place, to bring the border and its drug wars to English readers in America, and to take this place from being a faraway place for our entertainment and make it instead part of our conversation and discussion, to make it real. Because if I'm about anything, I'm about making it real. I'm going to read a few minutes from our Lost Border, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. So, this book is divided into it's an international anthology between Mexican writers who write in Spanish and English. Originally they're written in Spanish and then we translated them to English. And American writers like myself who are writing in English. So it's both in Spanish and English. And I'm reading from my essay called A World Between Two Worlds, and tell you a little bit about Juarez and El Paso. And I'm writing about my cousins and what happened to them. So this is about one of my cousins. Just like his mother, my cousin Chavita, the young entrepreneur, was making it happen. He was living in between two worlds, two cultures. He arrived at his job as an architect in El Paso at 6:30 a.m., worked until 4 p.m., then drove across an international bridge to Juarez to manage Café Miro with his wife until 10 p.m. One of the things that you may not know is that Juarez and El Paso are really one city divided by the Rio Grande, which is not bigger than a canal. It probably takes longer to walk from here to where we were in the cafeteria than to go across the border. It's that close. Then he would do it again the next day. Chavita said, "The lines at the bridges started getting longer after 9/11, so I had to purchase 2 trucks. I'd drive to a parking lot near the Juarez side of the bridge, park my truck, and hop on my bike. I'd bike across the bridge, flash my passport, and bike into El Paso to another parking lot on the American side, throw my bike into the back of that truck, and drive to work. My life was divided in two between El Paso and Juarez. So many people were doing exactly the same thing, day in and day out. You got to know them. I also knew most of the federal guys at the bridge by first name, and they knew me too. It was crazy, but it worked." Chavita imagined bigger and better things, and he had a knack with people and for convincing them to support his dreams. He had gained experience organizing events at his first bar. Café Miro was an even bigger success, although he was overworked and literally on the move all the time. He remembered the Guadalajara mega events that had originally prompted him to organize his first dance party years ago, and he expanded again, first at Carta Blanca Park and then at the Hipodromo Park in Juarez. He and a partner organized a music festival that attracted dozens of bands. The first year, 2,500 people attended their arts festival. Chavita and his partner published a music magazine and a website to promote their festival, to feature their bands and to allow fans to submit favorite photos and clips. Chavita was an avid user of Facebook and understood the power of social media. The second year, 4,500 young people showed up, and not only were their festivals filled with great live music, but also art exhibits, high-end coffee, and great beer. Chavita: "You wouldn't imagine how much time we spent selecting the right coffee. We wanted things to be high class, high end. Everything had to be just right. We wanted young people to have fun, to come together for music, for dancing, for the arts. People began waiting for a festival to happen. The third year, 7,500 people danced the night away at another of Chavita's events. No obstacle was too big to stop him for too long. Bad luck would not get in his way. One day he jumped in his Ford Explorer to buy medicines at a pharmacy. Suddenly a car with tinted windows blocked his way at an intersection, and several men in masks jumped out and pointed 9mm guns at his head. One simply said, "Nomás dame la llave y vete." That is, "Just give me the key and go now." Chavita walked away from his truck and survived. He loved Juarez. Although the incident spooked him, he never thought of leaving the city. In 2009, the 4th anniversary of their festival, the drug war violence broadened and deepened, but still 5,000 people demanded rock music for a few nights in Juarez. A few phone calls portended the beginning of the end. Strangers asked to talk to the owners of the music festival. And when they got Chavita on the phone, they demanded a percentage of the profits for security services. These strangers were clueless as to how much money the festival made each year. They did not know or care who Chavita was, and they laughed when he protested about his years of work and sacrifice to get to this point. For a few days, Chavita ignored these calls. One day, as he sat drinking coffee at Café Miro, an older man wearing a cheap dark suit approached the manager, talked to him in low and insistent growls, and brazenly began to inspect the place. Chavita had never seen this man in his life. The older man handed the manager a letter and told him to deliver it to the owner. To his great credit, the manager did not point to Chavita and say, "He's right there, the guy with the laptop." The letter went into details about the offer of security services and what would happen to the owners if they did not comply. It was nasty stuff. Chavita called the number in the phone, and the phone number in the letter, and this was more or less what it said. "We know where you live. We know where you bank. We know what cars you drive. We know about the bar, and we know about the festivals. This is what your payment will be every week. If you don't have a liquor license, or if you need a permit for anything, or if you have problems with inspectors, we'll get you the licenses and the permits. We'll solve the problems with inspectors. We are the government now. We'll provide you with drugs to sell at your events. This is how much you will sell." As Chavita said, it was very businesslike in a certain way, and in another way it was very graphic about what would happen to him and his family and his partner and his partner's family if they did not comply. 2 days after that call, Chavita closed down Café Miro, dismissed all his employees, and ripped the place apart for anything valuable he could take with him or store in a warehouse. In those same 2 days, he packed everything he could from his home and abandoned Juarez for El Paso. Chavita: "It's not about you anymore. It's about your family. I have 2 kids, 4 and 8 years old. I had to leave. In a way, I walked away just in time before anything horrible happened to me. I don't hate Juarez, on the contrary, but if anything had happened to me, if anything had happened to my family, I would probably think differently. I just believe Juarez has so much potential and I would like to go back." So then this last part I'm going to read, I'm discussing these issues with a writer friend of mine, and I'm talking about my grandfather. My grandfather, his name was Santiago Troncoso, and he had the big avenue named after him in Juarez. He was editor and publisher of El Día, one of the first daily newspapers in Juarez in the 1920s. And there's this statue called El Papelero, the paperboy, the bronze paperboy throwing a newspaper. And it's a freedom of the press statue in Juarez. And there are 3 names on that statue, and my grandfather is one of them. And by the way, he told me when I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer. My grandfather said, "Don't become a journalist or a writer, because if you tell the truth, they will hate you forever." That was his advice. So I'm telling my friend about El Papelero, and this is what he tells me. This is the last part I'm going to read. After I told him the story about my grandfather, my writer friend stared at me solemnly and said, "You know what they did to that statue not long ago?" In hushed tones, he described the scene, but left many details out, which unnerved me. I swallowed hard as his few words permeated my mind, and I imagined the images my friend had left unsaid to me. A hazy morning, the light revealing something next to or draped over El Papelero. Only up close would the images become clear. A human being had been disemboweled, beheaded, a horrifying mix of meat and metal. A warning to all the journalists, don't fuck with the narcos. To hell with the freedom of expression. What power does an inert statue have against such brutality? What power do reminiscences of what Juarez used to be have against submachine guns? What power resides in the small ambitions for a better life of someone like Pepe, or in the dreams of a city with music and arts of Chavita? How can even these words counteract decapitations, dismemberments, and the dollars, billions and billions of dollars, which reward the most brutals for servicing the United States and its drug habits? If you pitted an individual with great ideas against another one with a machete, a cage match featuring a philosopher against a foot soldier, so to speak, I would think that the latter would always have the upper hand. Yet it must be possible to overcome this brutality when we face it in our communities. Otherwise, killers without a conscience would always win. And every city, not only in Mexico, but also across the globe, would become another Juarez. I think the answer is that people don't want to live in a society where violence is normal. People cannot achieve what they want. They cannot strive for what most fulfills them in the kind of city Juarez has become. They cannot raise their children as they want, and they cannot dream of crossing to the other side for a better life, and they cannot live in peace even if they are poor. On this side, we cannot anymore imagine Juarez as an adventure or a possibility, as a place to shop for groceries, or as a destination where children could open their minds to discover another way of life and culture. The Juarez El Paso metropolis, before the drug violence erupted on Avenida Santiago Troncoso, and all the other streets and byways on the other side, was anything but ideal. Too often the citizens of each city used each other. El Paso, richer than its twin to the south, took advantage of the cheap labor. On the other side, what once were cheap groceries, gas, and medicines. So the Juarez El Paso area before the recent drug violence was not a bilingual, binational, bicultural Zion, but it was one world, one entity, one place, one city where you could live in between worlds, had the hope of creating something new, a third way to be, not along the border, but on the border. This is what the violence has destroyed, that unity, however tenuous it ever was. It has destroyed the idea of that unity and the reality of living so uniquely astride an international border. This real idea was always a work in progress, and for the moment, it is lost. Yet that real idea of unity had great value. It had great value to those like Pepe and Chavita, who literally lived in between El Paso and Juarez, making the most of their abilities and creativity. They learned to jump from one language to another, from one side of the international bridge to the other, from one set of rules and conventions to another. Their ways of doing border business fostered adaptable, innovative individuals. The border opened up who they could be, and they were flourishing. In this manner, I identify the most with my cousins Chavita and Pepe, because this border mentality became ingrained in the deepest part of myself. That is, not to believe in the national myth or blustery pronouncements, but to judge the person in front of you. That is, not to rely on stereotypes or seldom spoken prohibitions, but to test the waters with engagement and to find out for yourself what would work and what would not. Living on the border, the in-between two worlds, I believe, made me somewhat of a skeptic of both sides, but also made me find my own way through practice. That way of thinking and questioning frightens ideologues, nationalists, and anyone who prefers to follow orders and duties. The power of returning to that work in progress that was one city between two nations will be one day what will stop that machete from its bloody work. Enough people on both sides of the border will tire of living in violence, which is just another form of authoritarianism, and will organize themselves to defeat the brutal who now have the upper hand. Perhaps the killers will kill so much that what will be left of Ciudad Juarez will not be much of a city at all. And so they will finish destroying the prize for which they so readily slaughtered thousands. In any case, it will be the power of returning to that unique border life and whatever messy possibilities it harbored that will stop the violence. It was a better life than what we have today. And we understand that fact, mostly in retrospect, as we often do, when we lose what we value before we had a chance to appreciate what it meant. Thank you. Okay, so I'm ready for your tough questions. Go ahead, loud so I can hear.
What is the biggest challenge that you have faced, either in your studies or being from a small, impoverished town along the border?
That's a great question. The biggest challenge I face. I think the biggest challenge was believing in myself. You know, I didn't feel I belonged. I thought Harvard had made a mistake. As I was telling somebody earlier, I showed up at Harvard with bell-bottom jeans and Led Zeppelin t-shirts and didn't know Harvard and Boston got cold. I didn't have a coat. You know, I was like, who is this guy with the funny accent? So just believing in myself and working hard and overcoming fear. I think that was another challenge. You know, one of the reasons I studied so hard at Harvard was that I did not want to fail. You know, I know my parents had sacrificed the little money they had to send me up there, and so I wanted to not go back with my tail between my legs. And so, fighting that fear, overcoming myself, and a lot of it is sticking it through. You know, it gets better the more you work at something. By the third year, I had met my girlfriend, who later became my wife, and things, of course, started getting really nice and great. And so every year it gets better, but you have to keep at it. You know, you have to focus on what matters. But believing in myself and thinking that I belonged, I think was the biggest challenge for me. Did that answer your question? Yeah, right here.
How do you feel about the legalization of marijuana for recreational use and taking the power of that huge business out of the hands of the cartel?
Well, I think that's certainly something that legalization of marijuana. You know, I personally think it might solve things, but the problem, I believe, is that it has to happen everywhere. It can't just happen in New Mexico and not happen in Texas. It can't just happen in Colorado and not happen in California. And so, although I think maybe it could be a solution, it's probably idealistic and will never happen across the country. I think it's, you know, I don't know. I'm not an expert, but if it takes money out of the cartels, you know, maybe that would help. But if one state does not legalize it, then that's where they will be selling the drugs. So that's why it's. I think it's a possible solution, but it's maybe not realistic. That would be my answer. You know, that's just my point. But in all honesty, I don't know. I don't know what would do it. So I'm going to get to you, but I'm going to go to somebody in the back. I will. You're next. I just want to be fair and square. Somebody in the back who has a burning question they want to ask. Because I'll answer anything. I can answer anything about anything on your mind. And if not, I'm going to go to our young man right here. Come on. The front row is just doing a lot better than you guys. Remember, I'm the toughest dad on the Upper West Side. You know, at Yale, when I'm teaching a class and I have some kids who are quiet, that's the kid I focus on. You know, whoever is trying to hide, I find them And they know they can't come to class ready in my class because I like focusing on that quiet person who has not said anything. She's looking at me? You're not looking at her. Okay, go.
Was there ever like one thing that one defining moment that transformed you from like the Mexican culture to actually like feeling like you belong to Harvard and like the upper end?
I would say expository writing. At Harvard, you're required to take, I think it's still true, I'm not sure, but freshman year you're supposed to take expository writing, essay writing or whatever. Or, I think it could be fiction, it could be essay writing. And so that was the first course. I had a terrible roommate. I didn't really like my roommate. He was this guy from San Diego who was always walking around naked in the room, and it made me feel uncomfortable. It's like that's the other thing about Harvard. You don't know who your freshman roommate's going to be. It's assigned randomly. And I thought he was a little arrogant, and I was feeling like I don't belong and all this. And so in Expos, I was in Expos the first year, and I got an A- in Expos. That was like the first time I had success. And I'll be very blunt. I said, I can kick their ass. I can do better than these kids who assume that they should be there. And Carolyn Kennedy was in my class. There were people with, mucho dinero. I didn't have any money. I was literally working 10, 15 hours every semester, every week, to pay my way. So I think when I knew that if I focused on my work, if I stayed until the libraries, closed, if I did not mess that up, and I could get good grades, then I felt good. And so that class, I think that's the first time I felt, I can do it. I can do it. And great teachers. I had a few wonderful teachers that just took the time. I'll just mention quickly, because I don't want to talk too much, Jon Womack, who was chairman of the history department at Harvard, and he was a Mexico scholar. And he was this guy who would walk around Harvard in cowboy boots and jeans, and he was from Oklahoma. But he was chairman of the history department, a Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant man, but he didn't give a crap about Harvard pretension. You had to do the work in his class. You had to be focused and attentive. That's what mattered to him, the work, not your last name. And so when Jon Womack, took me under his wing and said, Sergio, we're going to turn you into a historian. He wanted to turn me into a historian. That's also when professors started noticing and helping me out that I felt, that I could do it. Other question. I know I'm gonna go to the front, but I'm gonna give the back right there. See? There you go.
So in your class what kind of?
I love that. You pronounced it beautifully.
My mom's from Spain. So.
Excellent. Bravo.
What kind of distinguish?
One more time. That's okay.
From your other classmates, what made you so not?
Well, I was a fat kid who loved to read. Does that distinguish me? And I was editor of the high school paper. I got great grades. I was pretty much an A student, but it was Isleta High School. It was not Blair Academy. It was not collegiate. I see the kind of education my kids are getting, and my goodness, I was not getting that. Isleta High School, half the kids did not even go to college. It was a rural high school, 99% Mexican or Mexican American. So it's very different from what it was here. I was a good writer. I think I was a good writer, and I had won some state awards. And in fact, to come to Blair Academy, I was one of 2 kids chosen from Texas to get a scholarship from Gannett to go to the Blairstown Summer School for Journalism. So, the Blair Summer School for Journalism. So, those kinds of things, I think, distinguished me. And the truth be told, Harvard would then later send me as an undergraduate to rural Texas and New Mexico to recruit other kids like me. They would say, if you can find the poor kid who's smart, who can have a good SAT score and do well, we want them. We'll help them. Because, they're desperate for kids like that. It's the same thing with Yale. So, So I think that those are some of the things that distinguished me. I think, I don't know, what other things, certainly not my name. Nobody knew who the heck I was. And, we weren't Rockefeller or Mellon or anything like that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else from the back? Right there in the middle. Loud, because that was a little hard to hear.
Scariest moment you ever had when you were living along the border? What was the scariest moment you ever had when you were living along the border? What was the moment you were most scared?
Where?
When you were living along the border.
When I was living along the border?
Yeah.
I mean, like, having to do with violence or having to do with just scary moments?
Just scary moments.
Well, I used to love to bike from Isleta to downtown El Paso. And it was about 14 miles. And I was like 10, 11, 12 years old. I would do that long trek because I would go to spend the weekend with my grandmother, who lived in downtown El Paso. And she was a tough lady. The very first short story I wrote and got published was called The Abuelita. She survived the Mexican Revolution. She had shot and killed 2 men who attempted to rape her. She was this tough as nails lady. Oh yeah. And I would bring actually my friend from Harvard to visit in Isleta, and they would meet her, and she would size them up like in 2 minutes of conversation. That this guy's lying to you. This guy's not. She was able to talk to people and really judge them quickly about what their character was. So once, when I was going to visit my abuelita to hear the great stories that she had about the Mexican Revolution, as I tell people, it was basically Call of Duty Mexican style. Very violent, awful stuff, and I loved it, as a kid. And it was real, these stories that she would tell me. And once I was on my bike going pell-mell down Paisano Drive, and I slid a big city bus went in right in front of me, and I kind of slid under the tire, and my front wheel got crushed, and the bus missed me by a few inches. So that's probably the scariest moment I had. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just surprised that it wasn't having to do anything with narco violence. It was interesting.
Yeah, again, I'm a little hard of hearing. It's not you, it's me.
I was surprised that it had nothing to do with any sort of narco violence.
No, I certainly had friends. The guy who lived 3 doors from us on San Lorenzo Avenue, he was someone I knew. His name was El Muerto. Never knew his first name, the dead. Literally, that was his name. And he was head of the gangs in our neighborhood called Barraca. And Barraca means shack. I literally lived in Shack Town. And the other side of a canal was called Calavera, which means skeleton town, because there was a church and a cemetery on that side of the canal. And so, I would see gang fights. I would see, you would wake up on Sunday morning, and sometimes there might be somebody like Joe Fierro, another gang member, moaning in the canal after a gang fight, beat up. You would see stuff in the aftermath of that, but nothing happened to me. And in all honesty, I think in some ways I befriended some of these very tough characters. I would help them with their homework, and they would not bother me. And they would say, don't bother Sergio. Because I wasn't a threat. I wasn't a physical threat. I was a fat kid who loved to read. And if I helped them with their homework and they passed, I got my posse. You know what I mean? And so they're not going to mess with me because I'm muerto. Helping El Muerto with Latin. And that was true. You do what you can to survive in a place like that. So other questions? Right here.
As a corollary to the second question about legalization of marijuana, what do you think is the most appropriate course of action that you prescribe to be most effective for combating narco violence in the borders? Because you mentioned educating people like us about our ramifications of drug use, right. But do you think that's enough, or do you think the government has responsibility or other?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think absolutely. It's just I do it through my writing because I'm a writer. But absolutely, no, I think police forces. The irony is that El Paso is one of the safest cities in the United States. It's usually ranked number 1 or number 2 under San Jose, California as the safest city in the United States. 20 to 30 murders in a city of about 800,000. Juarez, literally right, over the canal, in 2010 had 8,000 murders in a city of about 1.5 million. New York City, that has 7 million at its peak, had 2,000 murders. And New York City is New York City. So I think government has a role, the police force has a role. But think about what, I think of it, don't think of it so abstractly. Think of what it is that I can do. One of the things that I talk to you about in this thing is, what can you do? One of the things you can do is just don't do those drugs. Because it's more than an abstraction. You're causing problems for people down there that are horrible, that are awful, that you don't live to see day to day. And so think about what you can do in your life. Because you can't necessarily save the world, but you can have an effect with your neighbor. You can do what you can to help your siblings understand how important it is and how we are all connected. So I think government has a role. In the Mexican government, there are also a poor Mexican policeman only earning $20,000 a year is easily bought off by the narco traffickers who have billions of dollars at their disposal. So do what you can, in your role.
Sergio, we're going to have to end it now formally, but you can come up and ask some more questions. We also have some of his books here. If you'd like to purchase one, they're $15, and you just sign your name and print your name, and you're all set. But before we go, and before we thank Mr. Troncoso, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
What was your first job? Please.
My first job as a 12-year-old was carrying live chickens from trucks. And I wrote a story called Punching Chickens because my parents grew up in a ranch in Mexico. And so I made the mistake of letting my mother decide my summer job. And so she said, "Oh, you want a summer job? You want to go to the mall in El Paso? So here, I'll get you a job." So we would get these chickens from 18-wheelers, grab them, and you had to keep them away from you because they're pecking the heck out of you. And they're also defecating everywhere. So your shoulders are burning. You're keeping these chickens, who are disgusting, savage little creatures, away from you. And they're like pecking, and you can't keep them next to you. And then your shoulders start burning, and you carry them into these places where they have thousands of cages, and you punch them in. And the chickens are fine, by the way. They just pop back up and start running around. It's a really funny story. And that's why I wrote it. And you know how much we got for that 10-hour day? I was the youngest guy doing that work. Most people were 40 and 50 years old. I got $10 for the day to do that. And my brother and I did that job for one summer. And it took my brother, I think, 30 years before he ate chicken again. So anyway, that was my first job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.